It was 1 year ago that Prime Minister Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia passed away. I was in Ethiopia last summer in Addis Ababa when the Prime Minister passed away. I remember waking up on August 21st to this breaking news. It was very tough trying to accept the fact that the Prime Minister, who was out of public light for a significant amount of time, passed away. I remember walking to various meetings that day and listening to the emotions that people had, ranging from the young boy that shined my shoes in the morning to people within the private sector, in the civil society sector, and also in government, listening to the reflections that they had. I sensed fear, I sensed uncertainty, I sensed sorrow, I sensed anger, sadness, grief. But I walked out of these meetings with a sense of optimism, a sense that the progress that was achieved in the past 20 years would not and could not be taken away, but that from here on it could only progress. I was born in November 1991, just a few months after Meles and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front marched into Addis Ababa, ousting the former military dictator. Growing up, Meles Zenawi has always been a household name. As I'm sure it is for many Ethiopians, whether it's for good or bad, we've always grown up knowing the name Meles Zenawi. Ethiopia is a country where half the population is under the age of 20. So for most Ethiopians, Meles Zenawi is indeed the only prime minister they've ever known. I remember in 2005, as an 8th grade student, first learning more about Meles and becoming exposed to Ethiopian politics. I became very interested in political science and government in general, and took a renewed interest in Ethiopian political affairs. It was a few months before the May 2005 elections that I started doing more research on Ethiopia. I started learning more about the country. I started becoming very interested in not only its past, but the potential it has in the future. Ethiopia is a country where in 1991 it was on the brink of bankruptcy. It was on the brink of government shutdown. It has been known for quite some time as a case study for everything gone wrong in Africa, as a byword for famine, poverty, war, destruction, hopelessness. And indeed, 10 years ago, where The Economist called Africa the hopeless continent, it's now being termed as the hopeful continent. And Ethiopia, for the past 20 years, has been at the helm of African progress. Much to that is to the credit of the Prime Minister and also to the ruling party. The Prime Minister was brave. He was brave to challenge the world in a different thinking. He was brave to criticize the neoliberal model that had failed Africa. He was brave to go before the world in Copenhagen and criticize industrialized nations for their recklessness in climate change. He was brave to implement the first African democratic developmental state model. He was brave and witty at times. He was smart. He was intellectual. He was a self-taught economist. He maneuvered carefully through the worlds of the East and the West. He managed relations with China and the United States with great care. I became very impressed with him when I learned more in 2005, and the years since then, my impression has only grown. My thoughts about the Prime Minister are indeed mixed like many are. I am profoundly amazed and inspired by the transformation Ethiopia has made in economic and social development. I'm inspired that more women now are being able to deliver in a hospital or a health center, that children now are less likely to die under the age of 5, that women have a greater role in government and in the public sector, that youth and children are going to school, that people are becoming employed. I'm inspired by the growth. I'm inspired by the massive investments in infrastructure, the expansion of electricity and telecommunication services in the country. All of that is extremely critical for the country to move forward. But I was also disappointed on many levels. I was disappointed that Ethiopia didn't meet to the expectations of many, including myself, in political development. I'm disappointed that Ethiopians weren't really able to enjoy as many political freedoms that I've become accustomed to, that I've taken for granted in my life. I've grown up learning that critical thinking is critical. I've grown up learning to ask the questions why, how come, what if. And those are the questions that young Ethiopians in Ethiopia must ask. They must not be afraid to challenge those in power, whether it's in the government or the private sector. They must not be afraid to stand up and own and control their destiny. Meles inspired me. Dropping out of university at the age of 19 in 1975, he took a major risk. He and many others understood that the ultimate price that they would pay for their rebellion against the Marxist military government was indeed death. And they were content with that, one way or another. They knew that at any moment they could die. But that conviction continued. Knowing that didn't stop them. Their conviction and their steadfast belief in a renewed Ethiopia, their dream of a prosperous, transformed Ethiopia, never stopped. It was a candle that could never be blown out. And 20 years after the ruling party and Meles entered Addis, it's a different country, it's a different city, it's in a much better place. And for Meles to have passed away last year was definitely a tough thing. Of course, many Ethiopians were uncertain and fearful. To some degree, I was too. Ethiopia is not quite known for state funerals and peaceful transition of power, so it's indeed nothing short of amazing that Ethiopia has been able to have a new prime minister, whether it's in the same party or not, a new prime minister, a new government, and that it's moving forward. Progress won't happen in 1 year after Meles' death, and a man like Meles will be hard to match, but it won't be impossible to match. There are indeed many people in Ethiopia that are capable, more than capable, of leading the country, both within the ruling party and the opposition. And it's going to be very interesting to see what ends up happening in the coming years as Ethiopia continues to grow economically, socially, and politically. I was hoping to meet the Prime Minister for the first time last year. Unfortunately, that was not possible. I was hoping to pick his brain. I was hoping to challenge him on certain areas that I disagreed with, namely the anti-terrorism law, the civil society organizations law, and the media law. But that opportunity never came about. But from what I know of the Prime Minister, from my own research and the people who knew him best, I know that his heart was indeed in the right place. I may not have agreed with all of his decisions, but I don't dispute the fact that he did indeed care for Ethiopia's future, that he indeed saw poverty as the number one threat. And that's no coincidence that in Ethiopia, under the national security strategy, poverty is explicitly named as the number one national security threat. More than Somalia, more than Eritrea, more than terrorism is poverty. Because poverty breeds ignorance, and ignorance can breed hate. And building an Ethiopia that is healthy, literate, and employed is not just the job of the government, it's the job of all of us. Meles, in his years as Prime Minister, has worked to lay down the foundation. But he and all of us I think, knew that he wasn't going to finish it. Not not in his lifetime, maybe not even in my lifetime. But it's a process that must be started. And Ethiopia, with its high population of youth, is a country that must capitalize on its youth. It's a country that must invest in creating opportunities for youth to grow, to expand, to become critical thinkers, to become entrepreneurs, to drive economic growth, to create an ecosystem by where they can thrive. And this is the challenge of Ethiopia. That ecosystem includes informed public policy. It includes political space. It also includes investments in early education. It includes measuring the quality of education with the quantity that has been achieved thus far. Meles has laid a great foundation. His intellect was quite evident whenever he took the mic. He also had a sharp tongue. But these are things that we'll obviously remember about Meles to come. His legacy won't be determined today, it won't be determined next year. It will be determined by historians 50 years from now, 100 years from now. But what I can confidently say is that the train that he has started alongside with the ruling party won't stop. It is indeed important for us to remember that in Ethiopia leaders come and go, and that leaders, for as long as Ethiopia has been a polity, have never defined Ethiopia. Ethiopia has defined its leaders. And today, I want to remind you that for Ethiopia to move forward, we must look forward. Meles was indeed a major fixture in Ethiopian life for the past 20 years. He did many amazing things, and there were many amazing things that need to be expanded on. There were some things that were not quite so amazing, some things that many Ethiopians would probably not want to talk about because it would invoke emotions. But those are the things that we'll also have to talk about. The shortcomings are also critical. Evaluating where we are, where we've come from, and where we can go is going to be critical for Ethiopia to move forward. In the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, more investments in education, in infrastructure, and healthcare are going to be critical. But equally so is going to be the investment in creating an open political space. Not only for the sake of politics and democracy, but for what that can open in terms of youth participation, youth leadership, civic engagement, and then most importantly, creating that ecosystem for Ethiopia's young people to be able to imagine, to be able to drive, to be able to determine, and to be able to dream. And these are critical things that are going to be addressed by Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn government. And one of the things that inspires me most about the new Prime Minister is that he's not from that generation of Ethiopians that was in the bush. He's not from that generation that was wounded. The Prime Minister was in Finland when Meles and the EPRDF marched into Addis. And being far removed from it, and being able to see shades of gray where many see shades of black and white, is going to be a very key component, I believe, in leadership to come. For Ethiopia to move forward, it's going to need leaders that can see gray and not black and white. But for that to come, I think creating that political space, particularly for youth, to express, to share their thoughts, to become active participants in their destiny, is going to be very critical. And that is going to be, I think, my challenge to Prime Minister Haile Mariam and his government, is to come up with avenues for young people to become clear participants of Ethiopian civic life, to participate in the decision-making process. And that, I think, is the best way to honor Meles' legacy. Meles was not pretentious, he wasn't superficial, he wasn't impressed by sentimental people, And the best way, I would say, to lionize him, if there is a way, is to just carry out the work, the business of the country, and to continue moving Ethiopia forward. Its conductor may have changed, but the train will continue moving forward. And that is the way Ethiopia has always been. And I think that's the way it's going to continue moving forward.